Welcome, welcome. We're just kind of letting people filter in. So, as you're joining, I would love to know who's here and a little bit about you. So, as you'll note, I have some instructions for you on the screen. So, if you'll introduce yourself in the chat, provide your name, your role. So, maybe what grade level you teach, if you're a general ed teacher, maybe you're a special educator. Maybe you're a coach. So whatever your role is, if you'll drop that in the chat so I can learn a little bit more about you and who's here. And we'll get started here in just a second. Great, Jenna. I'm glad you're here. And feel free, if you guys want to keep your cameras off, I understand. If you want to turn your cameras on, that would be great too, so I can see you and we can chat. There are going to be a lot of opportunities for you to engage and respond in this hour that we have together. So be ready for that. And you're welcome to do that either by unmuting or through the chat. So whatever you're most comfortable with is fine. Let's see here. So Jenna, great. We've got second grade. And Hollis, Director of Learning Support at a small school. I love that. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Jessica, Speech and Language. And I think, Hollis, I'll be curious to see what kind of your feedback about what we talk about in this session. We've got SLPs, great. And a psychologist. Awesome. We've got a good variety here. We'll keep introducing yourself in the chat. I will tell you a little bit about me. My name is Liz Stevens, and I am an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm really excited to be here with you all this afternoon. In the next 57 minutes, we're going to spend some time talking about instructional alignment. So this is something that I think is really important for us to be considering as we talk about students who are experiencing reading difficulty and trying to move the needle, particularly in the area of reading comprehension. And so we're going to dive in and kind of unpack this, what it means and what it might look like for you all. And I think it's great that we've got some variation in who's here in terms of grade level teachers and also SLPs, a school psychologist. If you're in a director role, that's great as well, because you might think about what this would look like across your school. So this is wonderful. And Jenny, welcome, reading specialist. I love it. So again, I want you all to be engaged and to feel that you can speak up and get your questions answered and communicate with me during the session. And we're kind of a smaller group, so please feel free to unmute and ask questions as things come up. You also can utilize the chat. I will tell you that if you see me looking, I've got a monitor over here where I've got your faces up or your thumbnails and the chat so that I can monitor what's going on there as well. So if you see me looking away, it's because I'm looking at this other monitor. But anyways, welcome. I was an elementary special education teacher for 9 years before I jumped into academia and started doing research around improving reading outcomes for students who are identified with learning disabilities in reading, but also students who are experiencing reading difficulty. So students with learning difficulties in reading. So I'm really excited to be here. And again, we're going to talk about instructional alignment. So here's our plan. We just did intros. So if you're joining and you're a little bit late, please pop your name and who you are in the chat. We are going to talk a little bit about profiles of reading difficulty because I think that helps to frame the rest of our conversation. And for those of you who may work at Windward or maybe supporting students with dyslexia, I think it's important to talk about how reading comprehension kind of fits within this and within the context of word reading. So we're going to do that. And that will set the stage for talking about instructional alignment. We're going to talk about why aligned instruction is important, kind of what is it and why is it important. And then we're going to unpack what this might look like in action. So I'm going to give you some examples from a study that we're currently conducting and how we're implementing aligned instruction in these kind of different buckets is the way I like to think about it. But as we're going through and moving through the content today, I want you to really be thinking about how does this apply to what I'm doing in my setting? So, if you're Hollis and you're a director, how might you think about this across your school? If you are a second grade teacher, how might you think about alignment maybe across the content that you're teaching? Or maybe if you're working with an interventionist. So, start to think about and apply what we're talking about to your own specific circumstances and instructional settings. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll make a plan. So I want you to walk away with a plan for implementing aligned instruction in your school. So great. All right. Now, what you need when you see this icon in the top right, that is a time when I want you to engage and participate, and I want to hear from you. So you'll either do that through the chat or you can unmute. So I hope that you will do that when those opportunities are embedded throughout. So again, when you see that icon, that means it's an opportunity for you to share your thoughts. You also want to have your phone handy because I will be sharing some QR codes linked to resources. So you want to be able to access those. So if you want to snap the code, make sure you've got your camera ready on your phone, and then you will have access to the PowerPoint slides later. So don't feel like you have to furiously take notes. We will make sure that you get a copy of the slide deck. So by the time we finish today, I would like you all to be able to explain why non-aligned instruction might be problematic for students with reading difficulties, and conversely, why aligned instruction benefits students and why we should be working more towards that within our school systems and structures. I also want you to think about how you can identify ways to align reading comprehension instruction across settings. So core, that might be core and supplemental instruction or intervention, or it might be across content areas. And then we're going to plan 3 alignment focused action steps. So that's kind of your what do I do after the webinar next steps at the end. So the first thing I want to start with is for you to consider when you think about students within your school or your classroom or that you're working with, what needs do they have in reading comprehension? And I want you to go ahead and drop those ideas in the chat. So what are some of the needs? You can think about strengths too. Those are really important. But what are some of the needs that you see for your students in reading comprehension? And I'm going to check the chat over here to see if anybody else has joined and introduced themselves. Jenny and Marquetta, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Welcome. And Rashida, you're a Windward parent. Excellent. We're so glad you're here. Okay, so go ahead and drop those. Great. Okay, so inferential thinking, so those higher level skills, right? Being able to make inferences, that's a really important. Good. So keep dropping those ideas in the chat of some of the needs. Thank you, Hollis, for sharing that. So I want to think a little bit about what I want to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about related to. That's great, Jenny. Syntax, vocabulary. Good. So vocabulary is tied very closely with background knowledge, and syntax. All of those things fall within language comprehension. And so that's really important part for making inferences and also just for reading comprehension more broadly. So those are great things to note. Thanks for sharing that, Jenny, in addition to what Hollis wrote. So in terms of profiles of reading difficulty, I want to just set the stage for what we're going to talk about next, especially as we think about different needs of students and also students with dyslexia. So this is going to kind of help us frame the rest of our thinking. So I'm sure you all are familiar with the simple view of reading, but if you're not, we're just going to briefly talk about this. So this is a theoretical framework that is supported by research that describes reading comprehension as the outcome. So that is the goal. And we get there by word reading, which is decoding, and also having language comprehension. And it's a multiplicative relationship because we need both of those things in order to understand the text. And the ultimate goal of reading is to understand what we read, right? Whether that's for pleasure or to learn new information. But the goal is to reading comprehension. That's the outcome. So in order to do that, we need to have word reading skills and we need to have language comprehension skills. And you see that in the equation there. And if one of those is missing or impacted, that's going to impact our outcome, which is why that's a multiplicative relationship. So you'll see that within language comprehension, we include vocabulary, background knowledge, syntax, some of those things that Jenny noted. And then within word reading, we're considering phonemic awareness, phonics, orthography and morphology as it supports word reading. We could also put morphology and language comprehension as it supports meaning and vocabulary. But this is a helpful framing. So when we think about this, we can also conceptualize and consider different profiles of students with reading difficulties. So when we think about a student that has a specific word reading difficulty or dyslexia, that would be a student whose primary issue is in word reading. So their oral language and vocabulary skills are typically average or may even be above average. And their reading comprehension will typically be fine as long as they can decode well. So that becomes more of a challenge when their word reading might impact their fluency, but then it would also impact reading comprehension in terms as texts get more complex, right? So when the text, if the student can't decode the text well. So for students with dyslexia, their reading comprehension may be impacted by their poor word reading or fluency, but also their reduced experience reading text, meaning that they have limited background knowledge, or underdeveloped is probably a better word, and underdeveloped vocabulary simply because they haven't read a lot. And we learn a lot and we build our background knowledge and our vocabulary by reading a lot. So for students with dyslexia, that may impact the background knowledge and vocabulary that they have acquired. So the next category here is specific reading comprehension difficulty. So these are students that have really good word reading. So it's kind of the opposite of a student with dyslexia, really good word reading, but they have weak language skills. So that language comprehension strand of the simple view is where the weaknesses are. So word reading skills are at least average. The reading comprehension will be impacted due to the weaknesses in their language skills, like vocabulary, background knowledge, syntax. So again, some of those things that Jenny noted. And then we've got students that have mixed reading difficulties, which tends to be the most common, is that students are going to need instructional support in both areas. But I think what's important for us in our framing as we think about alignment is that structured reading comprehension instruction might be needed by all of the students in these buckets, right? And so whether a student has a dyslexic profile or is identified with dyslexia, has a specific reading comprehension difficulty or mixed reading difficulties, especially as they get into the older grades and we are expecting students to read in order to learn content, they might need structured reading comprehension instruction and support with reading for understanding. So I think that's a helpful framing, that there are a lot of students that are going to need this type of instruction that we need to support in terms of reading for understanding. And when you think about these profiles, it also helps you to consider the plan that you might make for structured literacy intervention. So, and a lot of times I think we associate structured literacy with word reading, which is really important, but we can also think about that and need to apply that to reading comprehension supportive instruction as well. So it's not only for word reading, but it's also for supporting students' reading comprehension. All right, now the examples that I'm going to provide and talk about in our time together are going to be specific to some work that we're doing in the upper elementary grades, but these can also be applied to students in middle school and high school, and even in the earlier elementary grades, just maybe some of them might be done aloud instead of written. So just think about that kind of as we move forward with our slides. All right, so we've done introductions and we've talked about profiles of reading difficulty, and now we're going to dig into alignment. So this is our hot topic for today and what we're going to spend the rest of our time on. So I want you to think about students that are experiencing reading difficulty, and I want you to think about the lack of alignment. Hold on, let me advance my slide here so you guys can see what I'm seeing. The lack of alignment in a typical kind of school setup or multi-tiered systems of support or response to intervention. So students have their core instruction in reading, right? You see that on the left-hand side. And then students who are experiencing reading difficulty, or they might be identified with maybe a learning disability in reading, or maybe they're working with a reading specialist, but those students are typically get some type of small group intervention and support from someone within the school. And they're working in a small group intervention setting. You see that on the right-hand side of this visual. So we've got these two placements of instruction that are happening, right? And what typically happens in the way that this is set up is that the core instruction and the intervention instruction is not aligned. We have a huge lack in instructional alignment. And let me explain kind of what I mean by that. So this instruction is not aligned or connected across core and intervention for students, and that it typically addresses different content, typically addresses different skills. It follows different sequence and pacing. The materials and the curricula used in each of these settings are wildly different, usually. Language that might be used to refer to the same thing could be different. So one teacher might use one term to refer to something, but a teacher in another setting uses a different term. And then it's usually, not always, but usually provided by a different teacher. So what we've created here is a system across students' school day where we're not setting them up for generalizing skills and connecting what they're learning related to reading across their reading experiences. So we're limiting intentional structured practice opportunities. We might unintentionally be creating more confusion for students because they're learning all these different things. And the students that we're most concerned about, we're asking them to kind of figure it out and connect the dots across their reading experiences. And then the other thing that might be occurring is that because they're learning more skills, more strategies, more information, more language and terms across the school day, we might actually be taxing their cognitive load. So we're giving them more information that they have to work with and figure out when to apply and when to use it. And that might be really challenging for students. So when we think about this, I want you to now think of the opposite. So what if we aligned instruction for students across these two settings instead? So rather than give and present kind of this incoherent, disconnected set of instruction related to reading across the school day and the school week, we provided a really cohesive set of reading experiences for students. And what I mean by that is that we coordinate our implementation of the same practices and core and supplemental instruction. And I'm specifically talking about reading comprehension supportive instruction. I think you could also do this with word reading, but I'm really talking about supporting students' reading comprehension with this. So we use a coordinated implementation of the same practices. We use consistent language and terms and follow a consistent sequence and pacing so that it's really connected and cohesive for students across their school day. So why might this be better? Well, in doing this, we're increasing practice opportunities. We're connecting new learning and prior learning. That responsibility for coherence, instructional coherence, remains with us rather than asking students to kind of connect the dots. And then we're naturally, in doing that, supporting generalization. So we're encouraging students that, hey, what you're learning, you can apply to different texts and different times that you read throughout the day. It's not kind of these isolated pieces. And then the last thing that I'll say is I've circled this intervention group here in green. And the reason that I did that is because one of the things that we've tried is front-loading instruction for students in intervention. Now, this is hard because it requires a lot of coordination in terms of the timeline and also planning across core and intervention, especially if the teachers are different. But if we front load and pre-teach things in intervention, then those students who are experiencing reading difficulty are better able to engage in the instructional practice when it happens in core. So we kind of give them a leg up and set them up for success when things are introduced in core. We've received a lot of feedback from teachers that they've noted increased confidence and engagement in their students when that happens. For students that sometimes are reticent to raise their hand or may not be participating as much in core, they're excited to raise their hand and share because they may have the answer or know something when that may not always be their experience in the core setting. So we've been really excited about that from a social emotional standpoint and supporting students' confidence and engagement related to their learning and their reading experiences, right? So what I will say, just briefly, before we get into what this looks like, is that we have done this. So we've talked about the problem and we've talked about a potential solution, and we've studied this through an experimental study where we worked with teachers across schools, and we did this at fourth grade. And our current project is at fifth grade. But I'll tell you, at fourth grade, what we found is that we provided students aligned instruction across core and intervention. And so you'll see that there's a row for what happens in core and a row for what happens in intervention. So within a school, if they're doing the aligned instruction, then students get the aligned lessons in whole class, core instruction, and they also get the aligned small group reading intervention. In the non-aligned group, I don't know why my mouse isn't working. There it goes. Students got their typical instruction in core, whatever was provided, but then students got that same small group reading intervention that we provided in the aligned group. So that represents a non-aligned typical RTI MTSS setup where the instruction in these two places is not connected intentionally in any way. And then we had a business as usual group, which was kind of, you could think of that like a control group. And we tested students. So this lasted a good part of the year, about 18 weeks, and we pre-tested and post-tested students. And I just want to show you, we're not going to go into this in detail, and I'm happy to answer questions later, but I encourage you to look at the bar graphs. So those students that got the aligned instruction, this was in content knowledge. So we used social studies content, passages related to social studies standards. They made significant gains in their social studies content knowledge compared to students who got the non-aligned instruction and the business as usual. And I think what's interesting here, and hopefully you find it interesting as well, is that the students that got intervention by itself, which was that green group, didn't do that much better than students who were in the business as usual. So we're not gaining a lot by providing kind of these isolated intervention blocks, meaning we have to think outside of just intervention to try to move the needle for students. And I think that's why considering what we can do across the school day and how we can align instructional practices and reading experiences for students will really help. So anyways, that's the content knowledge findings. And then here's vocabulary. So in terms of vocabulary learning, we found similar patterns. So the aligned students who got the aligned instruction did significantly better than non-aligned and business as usual. And then I'll show you this, the reading comprehension, these findings were not significant, but we had a really large effect size, which is very atypical for other studies with similar populations of students. But I'll just point out that the students in the aligned group started at a lower point and had a greater slope of growth there than students in the non-aligned and the business as usual. So all of this is really positive, and I think a good reason that we should start thinking about this, right? So now for you, I would love for you all to kind of walk on this journey with me to think about how you might implement aligned instruction in your particular settings. And I know they vary because you all have done or have introduced yourselves, and you're kind of in different types of instructional settings and placement. So think about how this might work in your situation. And I've been doing a lot of talking, but I'm going to start asking you all some questions here soon. And don't forget about the chat. So if you have questions for me, and you don't hesitate to unmute or post those in the chat. So what we're going to think about now is what does this actually look like? So if you consider alignment, I want you to think about this in terms of these 4 buckets. So you could align instruction in terms of instructional practices, content, language and terms, or sequence and pacing. And we have kind of a cool handout guide that we've developed that will kind of serve as some key notes. So feel free to snap a pic of that QR code if you'd like to download that Google Doc as a reference for later. But we're going to talk first about instructional practices. So how can you align instructional practices for students? And you can think about this in terms of settings. So instructional alignment across settings, which are the examples I'm going to show you, core and intervention. But you can also think about this in terms of content areas. So our teacher from 2nd grade, I can't remember if it was Jessica, but our 2nd grade teacher, this might be something you would think about. So how might you connect instruction in 2nd grade for students, or align instruction across, say, science and social studies and English language arts? Another way to consider that is with math, right? If we're thinking about, we need vocabulary instruction in all of those content areas. So we could think about aligning a consistent instructional routine for teaching vocabulary across those 4 content areas. So there's different ways to think about the alignment. If you're Hollis or kind of more of a school level building leader or leadership, you might think about ways that we can align instruction vertically across grades, right? Or maybe within grade level teams. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Now let's dive into what instructional practices look like when we align them. So I'm going to talk, the example I'm going to give is something that we do in our alignment project now. And we do that. One of the practices that we teach is get the gist. So that is a paraphrasing practice or strategy that in which we teach students how to read short sections of text and then they write a gist or a main idea statement. So what's happening there is that we're encouraging students to pause and think about what they've read. So they're reflecting on what they've read and they're identifying the important information, so that then when they get to the end of the passage, they've pulled out kind of these key ideas across sections of text and they can connect those key ideas together. So with Get the Gist, we implement a series in our lessons of instructional practices, and we do this consistently in both core and intervention. So there's the alignment, right? So here you can see these before, during, and after practices. We align those across core and intervention, but I'm going to do a deep dive and Get the Gist to show you exactly what this looks like. So I kind of already said some of this already. Get the gist, or gist is another term for main idea. A gist tells the most important information about a section of text, and it's helpful because it supports recall, monitoring for meaning, I mentioned that, and integrating information. So there are 3 steps in this process. The first step is, well, first they read the paragraph, right, or the section of text that you've identified for them. And then they say, who or what is this section about? So with that question, they're identifying the main topic. And then what's the most important idea about the who or what? So there we're getting at determining importance. So once you've identified the main topic, what's the most important information about that topic? And then students combine their answers to 1 and 2 to write their gist or their main idea statement in step 3. Some of you may be familiar with this. Maybe you've tried it. Maybe you haven't. If you haven't, I encourage you to give it a go. But this instructional practice is great because it can be applied to any content area text. It's kind of like a vocabulary routine. If you choose one routine, then you can apply that for students across their reading experiences and their content areas and their settings. So let's look at, here's a passage that we have our students read in Project Align on the French and Indian War. And so our passages are connected with the state and grade level standards for both social studies and English language arts. And then you'll see the graphic organizer on the right-hand side where we've structured that step 1, step 2, step 3 setup for Get the Gist. We also give students a cue card that they can use to kind of check off to make sure they're following the steps. Sometimes that support is needed, sometimes it's not, just depends on the students. But now let's talk about how it's aligned. So how is Get the Gist aligned in core and intervention? So in intervention, first of all, the practice is implemented in both settings. And so you'll see here on the left, I've got the organizer and what it looks like in intervention. So what we do here is we scaffold it and we break it down. So we start with students. First, they only do steps 1 and 2. And once they've had quite a bit of practice and feedback in a small group with steps 1 and 2, then we add step 3 later. So while they're working on this organizer in core, students are doing all of the steps and they learn them all at once because that is how we differentiate instruction, right, between core and intervention. And it's also how we intensify instruction and intervention. So that's one way that this differs, but it's alignment, right? They're still learning the same practice in both settings. So you're probably thinking, well, wait a second, isn't this just the same thing in both settings? Aren't students just learning the same thing? And the answer to that is yes and no. So yes, and that the practice is the same, right? It's the same. They're doing Get the Gist in both settings. It's the same 3 steps, so it's consistent. So that is the same, but how it's taught is different. So the practice is implemented in both settings, but in intervention, it's scaffolded. So we break the steps down. It's heavily supported with teacher guidance. So we have a lot more modeling. So a lot more I do if we think about the explicit instruction framework, lots of guided practice with we do. And then we pair that practice with really high quality feedback from the teacher of the small groups. And then in core, the how it's taught differs and that all of the steps are taught at once. I mentioned that on the previous slide. We go from modeling guided practice to independent practice really within the same lesson. So there's fewer opportunities for guided practice and we move to independent practice much more quickly. So less we do. And we also provide a script to support. Remember that little cue card with the get to the gist steps? We provide a similar card for working on GIST with a partner. So pretty quickly, once students learn this in core, we moved to a you all do where they work and they do a lot of practice in collaborative learning pairs, and we provide a script to support that partner work. So that's something else in terms of how it differs. So less teacher guided, less targeted support and feedback in core. So that gives you an idea of it's aligned and they're getting intentional structured practice, but it's different and it's much more intensified and supported in intervention. Now let's look at another practice that's connected to GIST. And then once I finish this, let me just check my slides here. Then it's going to be time for you all to reflect and ask questions. So that's coming up here. Okay. So we can take, get the gist, and we can teach students how to take once they've learned how to write gist, and this is actually really pretty cool. Once they've learned how to do gist and they get pretty proficient with that in whole group instruction, then we can teach them how to generate summaries using their gist. And this is pretty neat because the work is already done for them. So first I'm going to tell you what just a summary is, and then I'll talk about how we align it across core and intervention. So to show this example, I'm going to use this passage on the Boston Massacre, which is one of the related to kind of the lead up to the American Revolution, which is connected to the state standards. So anyways, this is just an example. So this is the passage that students read, and just think about core. So we're in whole class setting. Students read each of those 4 paragraphs and they generate a gist. So they read paragraph 1, they do their gist, read paragraph 2, write their gist, and they follow that same 3-step process. So what I'm going to show you here with my animations is that gist number 1, they do for paragraph 1. So here, I don't know why my mouse is doing that. There we go. So they've read their paragraphs and they've written their gist. Now, the cool part is that the hard work is done for them already for their supporting details. So all of their gists can become the supporting details of their summary of the passage. And we all know that writing is important to support reading comprehension. And so we want to integrate opportunities for writing and written practice within our content area learning and also within connected to reading. So there just one becomes the supporting details. You'll just see I'm showing here with these animations how it gets moved over. Now, what's different in just a summary, different but also aligned, is that we have them. The only thing that's new then here is we teach them how to write a topic sentence for their paragraph. And the way that we do that is we teach them to generate a gist, but they do it for the whole passage instead of an individual paragraph. So it's the same steps, but we just tell them to consider the whole passage. So when you think about this whole passage about the Boston Massacre, what was this about? Well, the Boston Massacre, and what was the most important idea about the Boston Massacre? And so then they generate, and I've got this up here. The Boston Massacre was an important event leading up to the American Revolution. That was our topic sentence, following the 3 gist steps for the whole passage. So again, we're aligning that same 3-step process, but now they're thinking about the whole passage. And then we teach them to take that sentence and restate it in a different way as their concluding sentence. And then that becomes the concluding sentence down here. The Boston Massacre increased the colonists' opposition to the British and their desire for independence. So that's what this practice looks like. And I think it's helpful. And also, we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from teachers because the work is already, they're not starting from scratch with their summary writing. They've already done the hard work. And students kind of like that too. When you say, well, you've already done the hard work, the supporting details are all there. And then you can start to work on things like sentence combining and how to make things flow. So there are other ways to integrate good writing practice within this, but this is what the setup and kind of the structure looks like. Okay, now let's talk about how we align this across core and intervention. So students work on GIST and core and intervention. And core, it's faster paced. There's less modeling. We talked about this already. But intervention is a deeper dive. So it's more supported. They may only do a gist for 2 paragraphs instead of all 4, where they would be expected to do all 4 in core. Now, with just a summary, what we do not actually do the written summary and intervention simply because of time. It's a 30-minute block, and we just don't have time to do that. But we prep students for this practice in core by having them work on passage level gists, and they do that aloud. So in intervention, they will practice a passage level gist where they're thinking about the whole passage, and they will follow the 3-step process. They don't write it down, but they just generate that out loud. So we're giving them practice with that topic sentence. We're just doing it orally in intervention. So that's one way that we align it. And let's see here. Oh, there's my animation. Okay. Yes. Let me just make sure everything showed up there for you guys. And it did. So that's how we prep students for doing the topic sentence. So we give them we front load that, work on, they've already done the gist and they've had a lot of practice for gist in core and intervention, but then we front load that topic sentence work with a passage level gist by practicing that orally, which is done aloud in small group intervention before it's introduced in core. So that is how we align both gist and also just a summary across core and intervention in Project Align. So what I want to do is, I've been talking a lot, so let's pause, and I would love to hear from you, and consider, you can unmute. This is a good time to ask questions if you have questions, or you can write in the chat a question that you might have. But I'd also love for you to think about one reading comprehension practice that you could align across your own particular setting. So maybe that's a vocabulary routine. Maybe it's questioning. Maybe you're teaching students to ask and answer questions. Maybe it's get the gist if you want to give that a try. Or it might be another practice that you're currently using, but I'd love to have a minute or two to reflect and hear what you guys are thinking. So go ahead and feel free to unmute or pop your ideas in the chat. And then we'll talk about the next couple of alignment buckets. Great. Okay, so Jenna noted direct vocabulary instruction for language arts and science. I love it. And science is packed with vocab, right? And so is, frankly, so is social studies. And also, in fact, let me just pop ahead because I don't think we're going to have time. Let me show you, Jenna. This was in some of my hidden slides. This is the vocabulary map that we use, and you see what it's a little abbreviated in intervention, but it's the same components where we do a deeper dive in intervention and give students some practice in front loading before it gets introduced in core. So that is a good example that connects with what you were bringing up, Jenna. So that's great. I mean, thinking about a consistent vocabulary routine is awesome. And let's see what else. So Jessica has a question here. Would you recommend using the same passages in core and intervention? I'm going to get to that next. That's a perfect lead in. When having students practice gist. Yes, we do that. We use the same and we also use different, and I'll explain why. And I think it relates to building knowledge, but also giving them that front loading and kind of a deeper dive where they can dig in a bit deeper into the passages. So I'll come back to that, Jessica. Great question. And yeah, let's see, using gist statements. Kinjal, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And if I'm not, please correct me. Gist statements with young students. It helps with oral language development. Yeah, that's great. And even syntax, right? That's great. And sentence structure is really helpful. And Allison, oh, good to see you. I'm glad you're here. Aligning vocabulary instruction across content areas in core and intervention. Great. Consistency with definitions, study guides, and visuals for vocabulary. Excellent, Jenna. That's right. And it takes a little bit more work on our part, right? But it's so helpful. I think the potential yield and gain for students is awesome. And yeah, okay, so, and Hollis brings up, this makes a lot of sense. I also like how it, and then my mouse is covering up part of it, how it can teach classroom teachers excellent strategies for teaching these skills that they may not have had, will require training and coaching and collaboration with the interventionists. You are exactly right. But I will say this builds capacity in your schools. And the reason, and we have also done this through a project called Middle School Matters. In fact, there's some great resources on Get the Gist and some other things, even a vocabulary routine, and you can use them in other grades. So if you're not a middle school teacher, don't feel like you can't go there. But the website is greatmiddleschools.org. But I think one of the things that we did, Hollis, there that might be relevant to what you're bringing up is that we made our professional learning very limited in scope. So we chose one practice to focus on for fall and one practice to focus on for spring. And we had all of the teachers implement that same practice consistently across that semester and across content areas. So ELA, science, and social studies teachers were all doing Get the Gist in fall. And then we were all doing question generation in spring. And so it makes it really doable, and it doesn't seem overwhelming because it can be easily integrated into the text that teachers are already using. And it's not a heavy lift in that we're asking teachers to kind of do something completely different or overhaul their existing practice. It's integrating a high yield practice with what teachers are already doing and supporting students' text reading and comprehension. So that's great. Good connection. Well, these are awesome ideas, and I appreciate everything that you all are sharing. So I'm looking at the time, 7 minutes. All right, here's what we're going to do next. We're going to go to this next. Oh, wait a minute. And now I'm here. Wait, I forgot I jumped ahead to show you the vocabulary. Okay, we can talk quickly about these next buckets. So content and language. So this connects back to Jessica's questions around the passages. So what we have done is, and what I would encourage you to do, is we use some of the same passages. So what you'll see here are the passages that we use for the American Revolution, which is our Unit 3 in intervention on the left, and then the passages that we use in core on the right. We have more lessons in intervention 3 times a week. We have core lessons twice a week. So that's why there's a different number in each column. But what's underlined in blue, those are the same passages. So passage overlap. So we do repeat the passages in core. We do have students read those in intervention. One thing that does is provides repeated reading opportunities. So we're also working on fluency because they're giving opportunities to repeatedly read text. The other thing that it does is it gives them an opportunity in intervention to take a little more time with support in a small group and do a deeper dive into those paragraphs and the content and work on things like gist in a more structured setting. So that's really helpful rather than throwing completely different passages in both places. And then we also add, you'll notice that there are some, and let me see if my animation will pop up here. I think they're highlighted. There we go. We circled them in orange. So these passages are new. So those are not read in core, but they're read in intervention and they're connected. So let me show you what this looks like on the next page. So the spirit of 1776 and Independence Day, those 2 passages in a week would be read in core. And they would also be, they would be read in intervention, and then they would eventually be read in core, but not in the same week. And then we have the intervention only passage is a passage that we chose. So this also gets at your idea, Jessica, that is connected because we want to build students' knowledge around topics, right? So that gets at that, I think it was Jessica, but maybe somebody else around this idea of like thematic text sets. So we brought in this other passage around Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence to build students' knowledge, but it's very much connected. It's not a totally different topic about animals or something else. It's very much connected to what they're learning about related to the American Revolution and Independence Day in 1776. So that gives you an idea. So it's some overlap, and also something new, but very much connected in terms of content so that we can focus on building knowledge. So that is what I would recommend in terms of content, is to think about how you can connect content and you can also connect passages. The other thing, and this is a really quick one, but this bucket, and this is easy. This is an easy thing for us to do. Let's just make things simpler for kids by using consistent terminology and language. So, if we're all saying gist, let's say gist instead of just a main idea. It's okay to teach students that that's what it means, but let's be consistent so that students know that it's the same, what you're asking for when you bring it up. And if you're working with students who may be emergent bilingual learners, or even students who may be bidialectal or have language variation. Those are things that can help reduce cognitive load. So we want to be thoughtful about that. And think about, another way is if you think about even within mathematics, using consistent language and terms across your grade level bands is really important. Okay, I just had an example here of get the gist, but we've already talked about it. So, and I had time to reflect here, but since we have only 3 minutes, I'm just going to jump on to the last bucket so we can be sure to get this done before we open it up for some questions. So the last thing that I want you to think about in terms of alignment, so we've talked about practices, we went over get the gist and just a summary. We've talked about content in terms of the passages or the material that students are learning, trying to have some overlap, but maybe also something new as long as it's related and connected and you're building knowledge. We've talked about language and terms. Now we're going to talk about sequence and pacing. So this is hard because it requires coordination between the interventionist and your core teachers. And maybe some collaboration and co-teaching in a certain way in terms of planning, co-planning, maybe is what I should say. But I think it's worth it if we can choose something small and focus on that small thing. So maybe it's just one practice, like get the gist. Maybe it's a vocabulary routine, but if we can front load that for students in intervention, that really benefits students when they do it in core because they have a leg up. So rather than starting from scratch and that practice opportunity in core being not very meaningful, and I will just say as an aside, when I would watch the students that I would support in course ELA settings or even social studies when they were reading content area texts, they were sometimes lost or they looked lost. They had a hard time keeping up. And so that hard time keeping up, if we can try to combat that by giving them, some instruction ahead of time where we front load things. And then when those practice opportunities are introduced in core, it's better use of their time. They're more able to benefit from it. They'll feel more confident and they'll actually get something out of those practice opportunities. So I think that's worth considering, even though it might be kind of challenging. So think about, in terms of the sequence, scope and sequence, the alignment of content, the overlap in passages, practices, and consistent routines. So as an example of what this looks like and how we do this is that we think about get the gist. This week 1, we don't introduce it in core. So in the gray row is our intervention. So we have 3 lessons where they're practicing get the gist, where it's modeled and we do guided practice and it's modeled again. And then we have a modeling and a guided practice. All of that happens across week 1 and 2 before it's even introduced in core. So we're really setting students up for success with get the gist so that when it's introduced in core, they're ready to roll. And then we have those 2 lessons there in core that you can see in green. So that is an example of that. Now, my last thing here that I wanted us to do was really for you to have some time to think about how you would take what we've talked about related to these buckets. And it is overwhelming to try to think about doing all of this at once. So don't do that, right? Let's zoom in and make this doable. So choose one instructional practice. Or maybe look at the content and think about how can I work on overlap in passages so that I can support students with learning related content across their settings. Or maybe it's working with your grade level team and just focusing on getting a cohesive set of language and terms around a particular topic or area that you're working on. So choose one thing and let's start there. And then as you feel better about that, you can add in and kind of expand this. But let's start small initially. I would encourage you to think about a practice that you can implement either across settings or across content areas. And as you're thinking about that, I'd love for you to type that in the chat, share with me, or feel free to unmute. And then I do want to give you an opportunity. Oh, I was not showing you guys the right slide. This was the slide that I meant to be showing you. So please feel free to ask questions. So you can unmute or you can post them in the chat and I'll answer. The studies that we did that I briefly shared the results on earlier are here, and you can find those through the QR codes, but they are behind a paywall. So if you are really interested in reading those, you can email me and I would be happy to share them with you. So that's just in case you want to, you really want to read more about that. So one was the main alignment study. And in the second one, we looked at the impact of alignment for students that have reading difficulties and also inattention challenges. So if either of those are of interest to you, you can locate them there. But let's see what questions you have and put your ideas for how you're going to work on alignment when you get back to your schools. So I'd love to hear from you. Okay, great. So Allison has a question. If we wanted to take a first step as a school towards alignment, do you have a suggestion to get the most buy-in? Yeah, I think that is a great question. And I think that that's important and something to really consider. I think it depends somewhat, Allison, around the dynamics of, your school best. I do think that the results of the study, for me, when I look at those bar graphs, it's pretty impactful, I think. To consider, wow, when we give students this aligned instruction, we really can give them a boost. And so I think that sharing, and I also think that teachers should be informed consumers of research, right? So I think that sharing the actual studies and talking about the data and why it might be particularly impactful for your students would be one way to do that. I think the other thing that we're learning more and more with research, to get at your question, Allison, I think is, and this is probably a little more nuanced, I think, at Windward, but and maybe it doesn't apply as much. But I think in a public school setting where we've got core and intervention, a lot of studies with students with reading difficulty, we are not moving the needle with these isolated intervention blocks. So we have to think more holistically about students, more system-wide about their school day, because we can't make enough progress, or we can't intervention our way out of these problems is one way that I hear it referred to. So Jenny, let me share. Here's my email. Nope. Yes, it's at the bottom of the slide. So feel free to email me there. And Jessica loves the idea of get the gist and connecting with teachers when lesson planning to pick text to use with students in intervention. Awesome. I love that. And it's a quick and accessible way to begin building in more collaboration and alignment. Yeah. And we all have the same goal, right? I mean, I think too, it's was easy for me as a special educator to feel pretty protective and as a strong advocate for my students. But I think it's also, we all want students to do well. So I think if that we're all there for that same goal, and that helps. And Rashida, great. Email me and I'd be happy to share those with you. So, and Julie shared the slide deck. So if you all have any other questions, I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, you guys have been great for, I know it's the evening and it's dinner time. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and join us. And if you're interested in learning about math vocabulary, I'll be back in the summer. And we're going to do a really deep dive into that. And I'm really excited about that. So I hope you all will consider coming to that too.